it's high, high, hey, the army's on its way. Held off the cages out and strong. For wherever we go, you will always know that the army goes rolling along.
Hi, welcome to Pegasus Research Substack Week in Review, Unscripted number 37 podcast. I am Thomas, the founder of, the author for Pegasus Research. I'm an economist, military historian, and a U.S. Army veteran. If you like my content and want to support my work, please consider becoming a subscriber or follower on Substack, or provide one-time support on Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, or Ko-Fi. The websites will be in the description section of this podcast. Well, welcome everybody in the U.S. I hope you had a great Thanksgiving and are enjoying Thanksgiving week. If you were big into it, I hope you had a fun Black Friday spree, looking for the bargains, or just enjoying the show. Football. It's, here in the U.S., it's the rivalry week. Of course, there's the NFL games on Thanksgiving. So I hope all of you had a good time. For non-U.S. followers, I hope you had a great week and having a relaxing weekend. I currently, as you could probably tell, I am fighting a cold and a cough. And so my voice is kind of messed up. I'll try to keep my voice together. I do cough some, so I apologize. I will try not to cough away from the microphone, or you'll have weird cuts where I'll have to stop the recording and pick it up, where I left off. Fortunately, because of the holiday week, Thanksgiving, there was no Wednesday post, so there's only 2 posts for this week to go over. So this will be a shorter than normal podcast, which will save you from listening to my voice, save me from losing my voice, and help all of you get back on with your holiday weekend or your weekend. So the 2 articles were the West Philippine Sea Newsletter, Volume 21, and the U.S. Marine Corps and U.S. Army deployments in the Pacific. Excuse me. All right. So the West Philippine Sea Newsletter, Volume 21. Wow. As I put in the comment or in the secondary title, this was not in my bingo card. So the presidential election in 2022 in the Philippines was unlike the U.S., vice president is a separate election. President is a separate election. So it's not like here in the U.S. where there's a ticket where you pick your running mate and then you run a campaign. There they are separate elections at the same time, but separate. You run for election for each office. So in 2022, presidential and vice presidential elections were held in the Philippines, and it formed what was called a Uniteam Alliance ticket, comprising of the son and daughter of the 2 previous presidents, the vie for positions of president and vice president. First was Ferdinand Marcos Jr., who is the son of longtime president Ferdinand Marcos. And the other was Sara Duterte, who is the daughter of the prior president. Marcos and Duterte are fierce rivals, so the fact that they ran together in what was called a Uniteam Alliance ticket for the president and vice president was unexpected, to see 2 rival families or 2 rival family blocks form an alliance to win the election, and they did in fairly convincing fashion. Now, I will go into a little bit about the government, and then I'll take some of the my thoughts on that, is political thoughts anyway. Ferdinand Marcos Jr. was elected the president, of course, and Sara Duterte was appointed as the vice president, but she was also, in a promise as part of the Uniteam ticket, she received a cabinet appointment in the government. She was I think she was basically the Secretary of Education or Department of Education under the Marcos cabinet. And she was also the co-chair of the task force dealing with the insurgency that is the low-level insurgency that's contagious in the Philippines. Excuse me. So that has been something that she was assigned. So she had a role outside of being vice president. She was part of the Marcos cabinet. Well, a couple things that my view on this, and this is where it's not really a surprise. At some point, because of the rivalry between Marcos and Duterte, at some point, because Marcos can only run in Philippine law, you can only run for president, or you can only be president for 1 6-year term. You don't run for re-election. And so Marcos, as being the not being able to run again, and Vice President Duterte having presidential aspirations, just normal flow of politics, at some point she had to differentiate herself from Marcos, because remember, she's not part of the Marcos block of political support. She's part of the Duterte block of political support. Uniteam was just a temporary exigency for the election. So it was not expected to be a new political party or political union. At some point, Vice President Duterte would have to start separating herself to keep her loyal supporters on her side, which for the most part are also the loyal supporters of her father, Rodrigo Duterte. So at some point, again, she had to differentiate herself at some point from the Marcos political appointment or the political alignment, just to show that she was getting ready to run for 2028 election. And again, at some point she needed to, the alliance was going to be short-lived, because politics were going to tell it had to be short-lived, because these two, it would have been different if they were from the same political bloc, but they're not. At some point she had to differentiate herself from the president. Well, that split did happen in early 2024, and there was suspicion that the Marcos supporters were damaging the reputation of Sarah Duterte. That would also be to be expected, because you could expect for running for president will also be people from the Marcos faction or Marcos supporters will also want to run. And just like in the U.S. or any other Western politics, you're going to start trying to cut into the reputation of your political opponent. That's called politics. So Duterte was at this point she felt that she had to start separating herself at this point after just 2 years of the alliance, which I thought was a little early, but again, at some point it had to happen. So there was the sniping, again, expected in presidential politics. And on June 19th, Vice President Duterte announced her resignation from the Marcos government to be effective on July 19th, 2024. Now, this means that she is resigning from the cabinet position of Secretary of Education. I believe that's what she was, and then from the counterinsurgency task force. So she was resigning from those two positions. She was not resigning as VP. So, again, she announced her resignation effective 1 month later. She did not specifically cite reasons, and neither did Marcos, for the reason for the split. They just said it was personal, or it was unknown. So both sides, both Duterte and Marcos, were quiet on the reasons for the split. Later on, like everything else, I think it was in August, they started getting more reasons for the disagreements. Duterte cited her disagreements over the national budget. Okay, that sounds like politics. Aggressive approach to territorial disputes with China. And some disagreements over some criminal charges being pursued against some religious figures in the Philippines. I won't go into depth on that one because I would be ignorant of the issue to understand exactly what the arrests were, and it doesn't really serve the purpose. Those were the cited reasons for the split. It not out of characteristics to sit there and say, okay, disagreeing with national budget, that sounds like presidential politics. Aggressive approach to territorial disputes with China. Uh, Rodrigo Duterte, the prior president, the father of Sarah Duterte, did try to have a more, I wouldn't sit there and say he was a pet to China because he was not, but he tended to have a more friendly relation and desired more friendly relationships with China than President Marcos does. I That's not to say that Duterte is pro-China because that is an incorrect statement in my view. But we'll put it this way: is that Duterte seemed like he was trying to maintain a more non-aligned status until they ran into issues with China. Was basically kind of ignoring, excuse me, was basically trying to ignore um, uh, the reaching out from the Philippines, and eventually Duterte started moving a little bit towards the U.S. But he was definitely not as pro-U.S. as Marcos. He was not anti-U.S. but not pro-U.S. He was not anti-China but he was not pro-China. He was basically, in my view, he was trying to drive um, uh, Philippines to a non-aligned status. But Rodrigo Duterte had some issues with getting along in the international community. He was very, very blunt in what he was doing. And actually, he's under a criminal investigation by the ICC. And that's kind of coming out with a split between them. So, anyway, they come up with a side of the reasons for the resignation. Nothing unusual about the reasons for the splits. It seems like a normal political debate between two factions, especially when you look at over the split with China. That is definitely an alignment that Marcos is going in a very different direction than what Duterte did. So I could see that as being a legitimate presidential politics disagreements. Something to be expected at some point because Vice President Duterte had to separate herself to be able to run in 2028. Well, she didn't have to, but it was where she was going to get her support from. The So some of the other charges come up in there is that the recent or the political crisis that has occurred now was Vice President Duterte's chief of staff was summoned to their Congress. She refused to testify and was basically charged with contempt of Congress and was held in the holding area of the Congress. Actually, the U.S. Congress actually has a holding area as well. Was held in the holding area and then was to be transferred to a prison until the contempt issue was resolved. Vice President Duterte stepped in and was trying to intimidate people holding her chief of staff to not take her, to release her. Some of the details are hazy, but it comes down to is that Vice President Duterte went into the holding cell that her chief of staff, which I think her name was Zuleika Lopez, where she was being held, and went into the holding cell with her, which is apparently not policy for Congress. But then again, who is going to deny the vice president? She has a security detail. There is questions that her security detail improperly used or threatened members to allow Duterte access to Lopez, which again, it sounds a lot like witness tampering as well. When they tried to go in there, the congressional or law enforcement officers to remove Lopez to take her to the women's prison, they were surprised that Duterte was still there. And at that point, Duterte stated that she was representing Lopez as her attorney, which Duterte is an attorney, and she is a practicing attorney or was a practicing attorney. So in that aspect is correct. But the law in the Philippines, if you are a president or vice president, you specifically by law cannot practice any other occupation while you're president or vice president. So she could not be her attorney, so all the privileges of attorney-client privilege were not there. So that caused another issue with dealing with Congress. So the heightened level of tension going in there. At this point, the Vice President Duterte stated that she got a death threat from, or what she interpreted as a death threat from a text message. It sounds like, or from a chat room that her didn't specifically, the threat was not specifically threatening her life, but it was a veiled threat on her life, or that's how she interpreted it. And so she held early in the next day, a press conference online. I was trying to find out more about this. Who was it with, like Gen All Press, or was it just through one press agency? And it's kind of a mixed review, so I can't verify how many outlets were involved in this, but it wasn't a private call. It was meant to go out because, again, this wasn't a off-the-record conversation that a reporter leaked. This was specifically a press event. Vice President Duterte stated that she was threatened, and that if anything was happened to her, she had contacted an assassin that was to kill the President Marcos, his wife, the First Lady, and the Speaker of the House, Romualdez, was supposed to kill all of them, and was not supposed to stop until all of them were dead. So here's the Vice President of the Philippines on an open press conference or press event, which I think was online, and stated that she had hired an assassin and given them instructions to kill the president, his wife, and the Speaker of the House. The Speaker of the House also is a supporter of President Marcos and also President Marcos's cousin. So obviously this made some headlines. Not so much in the U.S. Made some below the fold headlines, but at this point, the Presidential Security Command, kind of like their Secret Service, the protection detail of the Philippine Vice President and President is a combination of police and military. It's not like they have a dedicated Secret Service like us, but they do have a dedicated security detail that comes from both the military and police factions. The Presidential Security Command said they are investigating the threat, just as you would expect the Secret Service to pose a threat. The Vice President threatened the President. Again, this is just amazing that this would come out. And they are looking at potential action against Duterte. The standoff is that her threat was illegal, and clearly it was illegal, and this is going to damage her frontrunner status in 2028, because she could be possibly removed from office for this criminal charge. So the fallout from this also is, now that Duterte is so openly opposed to Marcos, her father, Rodrigo Duterte, the former president, is under investigation by the International Criminal Court. President Marcos has not been cooperating with his court, and has basically just ignored it, and he stated that he was not going to support this investigation. Rodrigo Duterte is being investigated for crimes against humanity related to his anti-drug crackdown. He cracked down hard on drugs, especially the mid and low-level dealers. It's probably not out of the realm, or it will probably be fairly easily proven, is that there's a lot of extrajudicial killings in this task force on the drug crackdown. Now, obviously, there's going to be drugs. Drugs bring violence and weapons and all that. And so, deaths are to be expected, but is the case of extrajudicial killings is another issue, and that's what the International Criminal Court is looking at. So, President Marcos now is open to actually allowing some cooperation with the International Criminal Court after this statement by Duterte, um, Vice President Duterte. So um, this might have an impact on her father, and also like now looking at her career is possibly under investigation because again, the criminal investigation is still open. It seems pretty obvious. I guess they have to determine what the possible threat against her was. Also, it's politically dicey to arrest, obviously, a vice president. I don't think they have the immunity clause. They might have some immunity issues they have to deal with first. Between obviously, though, this is a case where it doesn't seem like this would be political immunity would fall into, but it's Philippine law. So obviously, she's being investigated, but the charges are pretty public. Um, Now, the question is, the Philippines is in a long-going dispute in the South China Sea and the West Philippine Sea over island claims. So, knowing that Duterte is more favorable to China, not saying she's pro-China or her father is pro-China, just what I said, they're more non-aligned. They will be more amicable to a settlement with China that China could see as being more favorable, though China was not very receptive to Duterte either, because eventually there was some falling out between the two countries under Duterte as well. So, so China does kind of, you look at, well, China's benefiting from this political upheaval in the Philippines. General Bronner, who's the chief of staff, had stated publicly that the Philippine military is non-aligned, though they do follow something very similar to the U.S. model and most Western models with a civilian control of the military. So they kind of followed that same leadership, but that the Philippine military was not going to play a role, and that there's no change in the disposition or the policy of the Philippine military in regard to the South China Sea and the West Philippine Sea or in the insurgency. But if the political dispute gets deeper and there is a political crisis within the Philippines, it could be seen that there will be a lack of leadership from the top that China could exploit by exerting more pressure, especially when you've got a campaign, or not a campaign, but a presidency that is impacted by a political crisis inside the country. Because again, the two most popular factions in the Philippines, at least according to the last election, was the factions of Duterte and the factions of Marcos. Not saying they're personal political parties, but the factions they align with. So this is definitely has political implications into it. It's not, and it moves beyond just a simple disagreement over policy now. This is a death threat. You got the current president that might allow the ICC to investigate the former president, and also the current president, his executive branch might actually charge the vice president with a crime. And looks like the possibility, talk of discussion of removing that person, President Duterte, Vice President Duterte, from office. So it seems like a lot of advantages to China. Now, my view is China was not involved with this. They had nothing to do with this. Yes, they do have an advantage of causing turmoil in the South China Sea and in the West Philippine Sea, because a distracted Philippines, one that could be and a president who could be politically weakened. So yes, there is maybe some short-term potential advantages that China could exploit. But in the long term, Sarah Duterte looked like the most likely candidate to win the election in 2028. Certainly the front runner. Wasn't a shoo-in, wasn't guaranteed. There would obviously be candidates more favorable towards the Marcos position that would run and be competitive, but she was clearly the front runner. And her as the front runner being more, if she follows her father's lead, which seems every indication she would try to push more for the non-aligned. Certainly would be less confrontational in the West Philippine Sea than President Marcos. So it's, to the Chinese have been credited for playing the long game, and I don't see China playing being involved in some short term gain that would have weakened the most likely candidate for president that would be more favorable to China after 2028. I don't see China have being involved because this is, in the end, this is not to their favoritism because basically Duterte it'll be hard to see that she is politically viable by 2028. Between the criminal investigation, she might be removed from office and barred from holding office for this death threat. She's she's a possibility of being disbarred. That has already been filed against her as well. So there is a lot of headwinds for Vice President Duterte because of the threat she made. That was, and again, there's also the reason why her her chief of staff was being investigated was due to misappropriation of funds. So there is that is supposed to. They think that's or the accusation from the people investigating think that Vice President Duterte is involved in misallocation of funds. Again, a lot of politics that go on, and this was just a terrible decision by the front runner. So again, in the end, I wasn't expecting this at all. Who would have? And this is beyond when you see like in Taiwan or was it Indonesia or Brunei when you see a fight in their Congress. This is beyond that. So was completely unexpected. Again, I don't think China was involved because this is probably more politically more damaging to their international cause. Because again, they could have expected a more favorable policy from Duterte. So obviously they were not involved in trying to, or not obviously, more than likely not involved with this current scandal that's going on. And obviously there's also scandals in the Philippines where they're investigating potential Chinese sympathizers, or even, I think in the case of a mayor, they think that person might have actually be a Chinese citizen or a national that has hidden her identity. So there's plenty of China involvement inside the Philippines as well. But again, I don't think this was something that they were involved in at all. So I'm sure they'll find some way to exploit it, though, if they can. But again, they weren't involved because this actually hurts their long-term perspectives. So the next one is the U.S. Marine Corps and the U.S. Army deployments in the Pacific. So right now, when you look at the confrontation with that is going on in the Western Pacific, and there's plenty of going on. You got just mentioned China and the Philippines, China and Vietnam. You got its disagreement with Brunei, China with Brunei, but that hasn't flared up to any type of physical altercations, or at least none that I have seen in the news reports. You got China and Japan. You've got China and South Korea. You got the issues on the North Korean peninsula with the Russians stirring up tensions there between North and South Korea that carry all the way to Ukraine. So there's plenty to go around in the Pacific. But the primary focus appears to be either between, it's got to be between the Korean Peninsula and the actions around China's threats to invade Taiwan, or as they like to say, reunify with Taiwan. So the expectation that is, I've talked about this in Project 33, which is the automation development by the Chief of Naval Operations, her project to try to rapidly improve the Navy's capability in the Western Pacific to face off with China, any potential with the Taiwan invasion. So the Navy, obviously, being the Pacific, this is considered a primary service for the United States, along with the Air Force. So really looking at this, and this is a combination of the obviously air superiority, which has to be carried over very long distances. You're looking at potential bombing of bases in China if the U.S. decides to get involved in an invasion of Taiwan. So obviously, this is an area of focus, and the whole U.S. strategy. So the current administration, and a lot of listening to the next administration coming in from reading the writings from the National Security Advisor nominee Mike Waltz, is they are he came and said there's no real daylight in the Pacific strategy between the current National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and the incoming Mike Waltz. So he says part of it is like we're not no country should expect to exploit the transition point. So that is somewhat to be expected, but working on some of the other statements from President Trump and President-elect Trump and his other advisors that he's looking to be part of his national security team. It seems like right now there's not going to be a lot of difference between the two nations or between the two administrations in regards to deterrence in the Western Pacific. There will start being some changes and some separation, especially as maybe if China reacts one way, the way the current administration will react and the way the incoming administration will act could be completely different. There will also be a much more on the side of when you look at the Clausewitzian view of how military is, or military power is just an extension of political power. And when you're talking about the United States and China, economics plays in that as well. Is there is a distinct difference between the current administration and the incoming administration when it comes to that. So right now, my posit is when it comes, at least for the military deployment, there is not going to be a lot of immediate change. It will be the biggest change you'll see is between the two administrations, what you would expect in the action-reaction cycle. You'll see also a more conservative with the incoming administration on the economic front than you've seen in the prior administration, who did have some economic penalties against China. Tariffs from the first Trump administration are still in place. And then you have something like the CHIPS Act, which is to diversify the U.S. dependence from Taiwan's semiconductor production. That will most likely stay in place as well in the next administration. So I'm going for the point when I wrote this is that there's not a lot of split between the current administration and the new administration that will have an immediate impact to the military buildups in or military strategy and upgrading capabilities for the Western Pacific between the two administrations. So I'm kind of in the view with Mike Waltz on this one, who is surprising, which I even surprised to say this, is somewhat in alignment with Jake Sullivan. And there's a lot to say about Jake Sullivan, and the jury's still out on Mike Waltz. He's at least give him a chance to see how he does. So, knowing that the Air Force and Navy are going to be the primary instruments to carry out any type of U.S. Reaction to an invasion of Taiwan. Again, Taiwan is the most likely advantaged place for if China is to take military action, dramatic military action, a invasion of Taiwan would be it, because so much of their strategy that they want to accomplish in the South China Sea is dependent on getting into the first island chain. The Taiwan would get them into the first island chain, which means they would be more effectively to project force deeper into the South China Sea and actually enforce their claims in the South China Sea, and also threaten the second island chain and the Philippines, and also push U.S. carrier and Navy task forces further out to the east to stay out of the range of the, or to stay out of range to be to keep from being easy targets to the long range carrier killer missiles that China claims to have. They do have. It's lots of questions about how they can effectively use them, but they do have them, and it does. And the Navy should be prudent on how they approach using aircraft carriers in this type of environment. So the Taiwan is a primary focus area for China if they want to get a more aggressive policy in the Indo-Pacific. Again, I keep bringing it up. What is the first island chain? When you start looking at the map of the Pacific and you look where Taiwan is, that the fact that Taiwan basically hems in because the Chinese Air Force has to fly around the island of Taiwan, and it's almost sitting and covering in the central part of their mainland. It also serves as an air defense identification zone, provides early warning. So this is something that if China really wants to project force and have coverage of its Air Force and with its Navy. So right now, excuse me, the burgeoning carrier fleet for China, which has again, they're still trying to learn how to use aircraft. Their carriers are having, we'll call it teething issues for the very best, or like when you're looking at the one that they bought from Ukraine, basically it's an Admiral Kuznetsov class. Not a very capable aircraft carrier. It's just, it was, and basically they admitted it's more of a training carrier for them. The Chinese have admitted that. So if they want to project force with they have the largest Navy in the world. If they want to project force into the South China Sea to more effectively secure its claims in the South China Sea, if it chooses to try to close it down, which it claims it's sovereign territory, they would need to be able to project their Air Force to protect their Navy, because the Navy doesn't have enough aircraft carriers to be able to protect its fleet as it projects force. So China will rely on the land-based aircraft, and those land-based aircraft are severely limited by being hemmed in by basically having to fly around Taiwan. So if they capture Taiwan, it breaks them into the first island chain and allows them to do force projection, allows them to extend air cover more effectively to their Navy if their Navy chooses to project force into the region. So much of China's aggressive policies, if they really want to push forward with them, and I'm not necessarily saying they are, a lot of this might be threats to try to get countries to give in without a fight. I've written about it also, about a way that China could force Taiwan into becoming part of China without ever firing a shot. So there is several ways. So Taiwan really ties into if China really wants to become more aggressive in the South China Sea and further out into the Central Pacific, that needs to change, or it needs to have control over Taiwan. And the U.S. strategy is also based on containing China, based on the fact that Taiwan remains independent. So the U.S. is also focusing on the fact that the security issue is Taiwan. Now, do I want to fight a war in Taiwan? No, not necessarily. But there's also the chip capability. By far the number one manufacturer of advanced microchips and semiconductors is Taiwan, and they have trade restrictions with China not to sell those products to China. If China gets hold of the Taiwanese semiconductor trade, they will cut off supply of those semiconductors to the West, which will have an economic and military impact to the Western countries, China's rivals. So much pivots on, unfortunately, from the point of view from the U.S., pivots around the U.S. might be forced to have to fight over Taiwan. So, knowing that the Navy is way behind on shipbuilding, I've written about that several times, and it's true. And the Air Force is in better shape, but the many of the Air Force weapons were envisioned more on fighting because the view was okay, Navy, they can handle the Pacific. Air Force is more of a support service. A lot of the Navy aircraft lack the range to work effectively in the vast expanses of the Pacific if they had to extend over into Taiwan. So the Air Force has also been working on improving their long range strike capabilities. They're building they've started fielding a longer range anti-air air-to-air missile armed on the F-15s and on the F-22 and the F-35s. So the Air Forces really have stepped up their game and also working on extending the ranges of their aircraft so that they can fly longer or maintain or stay up in the air longer. Again, improving fuel efficiency or extend. They can't really change fuel efficiency. I'm sorry. Basically, find a way to extend the ranges of the aircraft. That means obviously maintaining air tanking or mid-air refueling. So they have to keep the air tankers up there, which also have to fly over the vast expanses of the Pacific. So there's a lot of challenges the Air Force has. But they're both addressing this, but there are gaps that have to be covered. Well, you have two other services in the United States, the U.S. Marine Corps and the United States Army, that have large forces in the Pacific. But in the way they're envisioning a war faced around Taiwan and trying to create a deterrent to prevent China from invading Taiwan, is there was no immediate role for the Army and the Marine Corps. So two big services, capable services, appear to have no specific role in the theater. Now, the Marine Corps, obviously, you watch the World War II documentaries and read about World War II history in the Pacific. The Marine Corps played a extraordinarily pivotal role in the island hopping campaigns to bring U.S. forces closer to Japan and basically eat into their empire, and then also was able to cut them off from resupply by setting up bases. By Marine Corps captures an island, Army Air Force or the Marine Corps set up airstrips there, and they're able to interdict more supplies or the supplies running into Japan because Japan was not self-sufficient. So they did rely on a overseas empire, and so the Marine Corps obviously played a large role in that. And the Army was also involved in island hopping, but for the most part, most of the assault beaches were conducted by the Marine Corps. There was obviously some few exceptions where the U.S. Army also landed in the amphibious assault, but also in cases even when the Marines took Iwo Jima as an example, where it was an all Marine operation, and obviously Navy as well. But there's other islands like Okinawa, for example. Marines land, then the Army lands as well. But the Army provides additional force, especially as the campaign goes on. The Army starts providing more and more manpower as the move from assault phase to campaign phase. This is not to say the Marine Corps did not have a campaign phase. The point is the Army also had a role to call it supporting the Marines when it came to the island hopping campaign. So you got two forces that had played a role in the Pacific, but apparently have no real role. The U.S. Army, United States Army Pacific, also has responsibilities for the Korean Peninsula, providing general theater security, but in a envisioned deterrent or war against China over Taiwan, the U.S. Army did not have a specific role either. Now, the case is, well, why doesn't the Marine Corps? They have all these amphibious assets. They have these Marine expeditionary units. They have the ability to land troops onto an island, and they're still trained for that. And they are we'll call it highly motivated, highly capable assault force. And so they're trained for this. So the question is, well, why doesn't the Marines have a role in a Taiwan operation? And it goes all the way back to World War II when Raymond Spruance, an admiral who worked closely with he was the chief of staff, I think, to Admiral Nimitz, and then he also served. He was at NIP. He replaced Halsey at the Battle of Midway when Halsey got shingles. Then he also was eventually, as the more and more U.S. aircraft carriers took on, he commanded if I remember the order right, is when Halsey commanded the major task forces in the Central Pacific. That was the Third Fleet under Halsey, and then when Halsey and his staff would go ashore to go back to rest, and then also planning operations, the Third Fleet switched over to the Fifth Fleet, which then was led by Raymond Spruance. Well, when Admiral Spruance and his team were not on rotation, they were planning, and he looked at him and his staff looked at the possibility of an operation, an invasion of Formosa, which is the island of Taiwan, or the island that's known as Taiwan. And it was determined that it was a completely impractical operation because there was a limited amount of time that you could that the seas were conducive to a operation in the Taiwan Straits. So and if you look at the map, Taiwan is a very, very large island, much larger than Okinawa. And so there's the seas were not conducive to a landing most of the year. And that's so you're talking about the U.S. Navy would have to operate from long bases from Ulysses or from Hawaii. The U.S. Navy now would have to also operate from Japan, Hawaii, Japan. So they still have a long distance if they looked at supporting an invasion operation in Taiwan. Also, you do not land on the east coast of Taiwan is completely inappropriate for landings. It has to be on the Chinese-facing side, the western side of the island of Taiwan. Somewhat lesser to the west, but it's more to the southwest. So a U.S. fleet would have to get closer to mainland China to perform an invasion of the island of Taiwan, and would only have a limited ability to maintain, because of favorable seas, to maintain a seaborne operation. So this is not a ability to for the U.S. Marine Corps to land in there, because again, they would have to go basically on in the Chinese Strait between China and Taiwan. So meaning they would be heavily impacted by obviously air attacks and missile attacks coming from mainland China. It would be difficult for U.S. carriers to operate in those waters because again, you have to deal with kind of when I talked about the USS was it the Eisenhower that was operating against the Houthis. That when you put the U.S. aircraft carriers into a geographic box, they are much easier to engage with missiles. And the Houthis responded to that because the U.S. had deployed the carrier in a relatively small geographic area to operate, and the Houthis were able to fire a lot of missiles at it. This would be exponentially more missiles coming at them in a smaller geographic box. So it's just not practical for carriers to operate there. It's not practical for the Marines to land there. And so all the issues that Admiral Spruance found in World War II still exist today. They are still valid today. Well, somebody says, okay, well, wait, well, how can China threaten Taiwan? Well, the difference is that China does not have to maintain a seaborne supply chain. They can run the invasion from their ports, their eastern ports, and push across their ships across the Taiwan Straits as weather is favorable. So it is much more advantage. And also, if you only have to do a short run, you can deal with the weather advantages. Also, Taiwan will be able to run, or China will be able to fly. If they get a bridgehead, they can start flying equipment into Taiwan, which is not something the U.S. Marine Corps could do. So it's just a matter that China would have the advantages of the interior lines. And again, it would be right in, as I said, wrote in there, it's in China's backyard. So Marine Corps doesn't really have a amphibious option against Taiwan. It would be as good as the Marine Corps is. It would be suicide. You'd be wasting multiple aircraft carriers as well, because nobody's envisioning that that the United States will be able to pacify China, even if they successfully prevent an invasion. So there would still be a lot of missiles, a lot of firepower, a lot of aircraft coming the way of the U.S. In any type of Taiwan operation. So it's not conducive to a U.S. invasion of Taiwan. So it's like Marine Corps and Army don't really have a role. So the what the United States is looking at is changing, and part of it's just driven by modern warfare, but part of it's driven by what is going on in the Pacific. So U.S. Army is obvious, or the U.S. is maintaining favorable relations with Japan, and notice that the U.S. has become much more, with President Marcos, who has been much more pro-American. The U.S. is working very closely, and they're opening bases or getting base agreements with Philippines to allow U.S. to operate in certain number of bases in the Philippines. And I think there's 7 or 8 U.S. can operate. No, it's 9, and 7 of the 9 have orientation towards Taiwan. So the part of the U.S. policy and why it's important to maintain a favorable relation with President Marcos of the Philippines, as stated above, and his political crisis is a linchpin of U.S. Strategy is islands in Japan and the Philippines. And that's because the U.S. Marine Corps and the U.S. Army are going to play a role in the war and the containment process, if there's war, in both deterrent and also containment of China if a war comes around. So the first one is called the Marine Littoral Regiment, and what this is a force that is roughly about 2,000 Marines, and it's called a stand-in force. So they are going to be pre-positioned. It's not going to be a case like an MEU is going to come in, invade an island, set up town. No, the MLR will actually be already on the islands that they expect to operate in, or at least have some form of presence there. And you're looking at basing the there's 2 MLRs, and there will be a third one, and they will all be in the Pacific. And what they're envisioning is that these MLRs have they have less combat Marines and more support Marines. So you're seeing in cases with these Marines that are in these MLRs, they will have they'll have infantry. It's the protection force, obviously, because they're out. They have to make sure that they can fight off any type of invasion if China decides to try to take an island back from like an MLR is operating from. They have support and logistic battalions. But the firepower of this, or the real firepower and the usefulness of the MLR, is they have an anti-ship capability, basically a surface-to-ship missile capability, a medium surface-to-surface missile capability, and also an surface-to-air capability. So they will be able to practice what's called aerial denial, area denial, and anti-air activities. So with Chinese firing missiles at U.S., there would be these MLRs from these bases they're operating at could serve as air defense to shoot down those missiles. If aircraft fly over, these islands would be able to run by the Marines, provide anti-air assets, and they could also attack Chinese naval vessels from range and also have strike the mainland or even Chinese sites in Taiwan. So these would also so you're looking at that there is the A2 part of A2AD part, area access denial is a major part of this, is that the Marines MLRs will be able to prevent activities of the Chinese around these islands that the MLRs envision operating. The MLR is set up in Okinawa. There's also one in Hawaii right now, and they are doing still some testing on it, on how they're going to do some of the resupply and logistics part, which is also part of the MLR. MLR has a really small footprint, so it doesn't need an it doesn't need an air base. It doesn't need a port. They're looking at autonomous resupply missions with semi-submersible ships that will carry missiles, can carry ammunition for resupplying it, and would be able to do so in a hidden fashion because these are they're testing these ships around Okinawa now for the next year. Is the resupply missions will be almost reminds you of what the Japanese did during the Guadalcanal campaign, where they used submarines to resupply their forces. When none of their other ships could get in, a submarine would come in, hidden in the shallow waters at night, semi-submerged, come in, drop off supplies, and then leave before the daylight hours. These autonomous vehicles that the Marines are looking at would do the same thing. They come in under the surface or slightly under the surface, very hard to detect, not big enough for a typical submarine to hunt for, and resupply the MLR. So they can keep a very small footprint and deny large areas to the Chinese Air Force and Navy, as well as attacking targets in and around Taiwan and China if it came to that. So this deterrent strike capabilities, because now this becomes a much bigger headache for the Chinese. So the MLR also would offer. They expect also they're testing in Japan, but they're also working that they envision that they'll be able to operate in the South China Sea on some of the Philippine islands in those areas. So that gives a role to the Marine Corps. It's not controversial. I've read, I think it's Compass Point. He's written significantly about the MLRs, and his view is that this is not a good use of the Marine Corps. I can see his point because he talks about the aggressive fighting force of the Marines and just the fact that you're just putting them on islands. You basically have taken the initiative out of the Marine Corps, and if in serving in MLR, they have an important role. But so the MLR is not without controversy, but you can understand how it's going to be used in an anti-denial area. Now, the U.S. Army is also creating something called the Multi-Domain Task Force, MDTF. And this is a operation that is not meant just for the Pacific, where right now the Marines, because Marines are very much focused on the Pacific, but not exclusively. They do have roles in other countries. Obviously, they fought significantly in Desert Storm in Iraq, in Kuwait, they fought in Afghanistan, they fought in Iraq during the Iraq War. They've been involved in other activities in the but the Marine Corps all the MLRs are directed towards the Pacific. And that makes sense because it's really meant, these MLR view is that this is a deterrent to prevent China, basically increase the cost of China operating if they decide to invade Taiwan. So it has a significant deterrent impact that is beyond just what the Air Force and Navy could provide. And it also provides a striking capability as well. So the Army is also looking at being involved in it, but unlike the MLRs, which are completely dedicated to the Pacific region, the MDTF is actually assigned to multiple regions in the world. And they are basically oriented towards those types of operations, which would have some determination on the force structure that could be involved in it. So transition to multi-domain operation. This is the idea of military activities on land, sea, air, cyberspace, cybersecurity, space, where there is more to operate on than just the typical Army role of operating on the ground and then also having the anti-air capability. This is establishing, the MDTF is starting to establish the fact is that the Army would have to operate in this multi-space. So the MDTF has it has a what's called a flexible force structure that can be oriented to an offensive or a defensive. It can be a support organization. The units that are assigned to it are flexible depending on the mission it's being assigned to. So even if it's an MDTF that's assigned to, let's say, Europe and Africa, for one mission, they might say, hey, well, okay, we want armor brigade and we want heavy artillery HIMARS units. And then for another mission, then maybe that same MDTF will switch over to being more light infantry, moving fairly rapidly through, let's say, a situation in Libya, for example. Let's not ever get involved in Libya, but an example where you'd have to switch over the mission where maybe the force mission doesn't require heavy artillery or armor forces, and is more infantry centric or special forces centric. The MDTF is meant to be have its units switched in and out based on the mission. Now, I'm very curious to read more about this, about the MDTF structure, to see more about it. I've read the congressional report, a number of Army reports. I'd be very curious to feel like, because it almost feels like the Central Command. The Central Command has very few military forces of its own. It has headquarters units. It has units that are most likely that are going to be assigned to it, that it has a cooperative relationship with as far as exercises and coordinating between the, let's say the I'll just throw one out there, 3rd Infantry Division and CENTCOM headquarters work together very closely, because the expectation is the 3rd Infantry would work with CENTCOM more likely than not, and it has an orientation there. But CENTCOM doesn't actually have a lot of inherent military force to it, even though it has a 4-star command. And you run into that with all these task forces outside of NATO, that these central commands or these joint commands in the military have very few forces assigned to them. When the mission calls for it, something blows up in CENTCOM, more forces are transferred into CENTCOM. And then when CENTCOM's done, or their particular forces, okay, we're going to fight in the mountains of Afghanistan, so you don't need any armor units. So the armor units would be the CENTCOM, but if CENTCOM was operating in Iraq, maybe armed forces would be involved. It feels like the MDTF is based on that type of flex structure, where it has a basic inherent organizational headquarters structure, but a lot of the ground out is filled out by other divisions based on whatever the need is. And I would be very interested to see that, has like how much dedicated units are assigned to the MDTF and how many of them are based on just having the staff and headquarters available to assign based on the mission, get forces from, let's say, Fort Riley, Kansas assigned to the MDTF running out of Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington, something like that. So I'm really curious to understand, but also like the MDTF will have military intelligence assets and signals assets that are not found in the MLR. So the MDTF, because of the nature of its structure, is a larger unit, takes up a larger footprint, but is supposed to operate in something beyond what the MLR is. So the MDTF requires a resupply base. Because it does have a larger footprint. So either it has to be close to a airfield, it has to be close to a port. It can't operate a little in more isolated areas as the MLRs do. So the Army units need more support. And that's very typical of the Army, is that it has a bigger footprint. It needs more supplies than what you find with the Marine Corps. And, Marine Corps has got a whole thing Marine Corps is like, you just get by with what you have. somewhat maybe tied into the Navy organization because the Marine Corps is a part of the Department of the Navy. Navy rather spend money on big ships than less on maybe things that the Marine Corps would need. So, but the U.S. Army is typically a much more logistical heavy organization, takes up a bigger footprint, cannot be as nimble as the Marine Corps and the MLRs. But the multi-domain task force, so it does have, again, it has the military intelligence signals units assigned to it as well. It has very similar strike capabilities. It will be also anti-denial capabilities, and that's going to be a big part of it. And it will have medium and short, medium, and long range missile capabilities. And it will have anti-air capability, anti-missile defense capability. So it'll be able to provide the similar type area denial that you find with the MLRs. The exception is the MLRs actually have dedicated anti-ship, surface-to-ship capabilities. Right now, it's not envisioned that the MDTF will have that capability. They might eventually in the future, but right now it's not viewed that the MDTF will be able to attack warships. So that also makes it is how would these two Army and Marine Corps work together? And it almost feels like to me, and I'm not a military professional, is that the inside, like in the Pacific, is that the MLR would work closer in closer to the combat zone than the MDTF, because the MDTF, because it doesn't have anti-ship capability, it would need that protection from the MLR before ship assets could approach the MDTF. So in the Pacific structure, and this doesn't count towards other structures, it seems like the inside perimeter would be covered by the MLR, the outside structure would be covered by the MDTF, even though they envisioned that the MDTF would be operating in the Philippines as well as the MLR. It doesn't look like the MDTF will necessarily operate in Japan, because that is an area, again, mainly an area of operation of the U.S. Marine Corps. So that's kind of my vision of it, is the MDTF will be more of a long range, and it will have weapons. For example, the MDTF force structure does allow for HIMARS, but HIMARS would be completely useless basically useless in an operation against the Chinese in the Philippines, or even as a deterrent factor, because they're too short range. So this is a case where if a MDTF was assigned to the Korean Peninsula, it would have HIMARS, but if the MDTF is assigned to the Philippines, it would not have the MLRS or the HIMARS system. It would use something else, something more like Typhon for mid-range, and eventually the longer range Tomahawk cruise missiles, and eventually when they become available, the hypersonic weapons will be longer range. MLR will also have the hypersonic weapons when they become available as well. So it's just typical. The MLR will be a much smaller footprint. They will have inherent resupply as part of how they supply their units. MDTF will require a much more substantial supply base than what you see with the MLR. So I do see variances, but the fact is this will give the two operating together, whether they move into say the South China Sea and north in Japan, is they will be able to deny access to Chinese operations from operating basically on the east coast of Taiwan. They will find it much more difficult. If the MLR and MDTF take up positions along those areas, it will be harder for China to operate on the east side or the east coast of Taiwan and to the south coast of Taiwan. So this is something that where the Air Force and Navy will be able to concentrate their limited assets where they would be most effective, and then the Marine Corps and the Army would work on area denial, and they both have medium and long range strike capabilities, and so could conduct offensive strike missions through their long-range missiles that to support operations. And again, this is a deterrent factor for China because it increases the cost of the invasion. So that's how I view this. This is not an atypical role for the Marine Corps or the Army because there's no real offensive role. Okay, well, they're launching missiles to strike out, but this is not a typical ground force operation as you typically envision, which is, you almost see it as like the Typhoon missile system is based on the vertical launch systems used by the U.S. Navy. The Tomahawk cruise missiles is, yes, back in the Cold War eras, is that the ground-based version of the Tomahawk missile was provided to the U.S. Army. Those had long since been retired as part of a treaty signed between the United States and the Soviet Union. So there has not been a land version of the Tomahawk cruise missile for quite some time. There's been the air launch version and there's been the sea-based version. Well, to give the capability back to the Army and the Marine Corps, the Typhoon missile system, which is based off the vertical launch system, was created. So it's, again, atypical offensive role for the Army and the Marine Corps, but it does allow the U.S. to use a significant amount, or there's a significant amount of assets dedicated to the Marine Corps and the U.S. Army, and the fact that they can actually create a force structure for both to have them operate in the Pacific to support operations against China in Taiwan. But more to the point is, this actually serves as a deterrent. Is with all these alliances that have been formed, and then you have a force structure to put actual teeth to all these alliances being formed to contain China, you're actually start seeing is you have not only the political and the military organizational assets of it. Now you're seeing the kind of call it the fruits of all these diplomatic initiatives that you've seen starting and really starting under the first Trump administration, accelerated during the Biden administration, and it looks like it's going to take impact with the second Trump administration. I'm not trying to point fingers one or the other. Just what I said is these were basically, you see Waltz and Sullivan basically agree with each other on this. You could see that this was basically a view that the military, the Department of Defense, has been taking about how they would have to defend the problems and the vastness of the Western Pacific. It's not I don't want to sit there and say it's basically a no-brainer type tactic that the U.S. would have to adopt something like this. That's irregardless of politics. Yes, there will be difference between the administrations on how they handle it. As I talked about, it is there will be an impact on how they politically react to the action-reaction cycle. Is though there will be a definitive difference, but then when you go in there about force structure and force deployments, it's pretty much something that's been in the works for really since China started militarizing the South China Sea. And that went all the way back to the first Bush administration when it started. So this is something that's been in the effect. It's also, it gives you an idea how long it takes the Pentagon to really move on stuff. So the U.S. Army is going to create 5 MDTFs. Now, these don't replace divisions. They don't replace brigades. And it feels like, again, what I talked about is there will be some dedicated access to the MDTFs, but these are, they call them flexible organizations. They make the point that these are flexible organizations that can change their structure as needed for the mission. Now, I did include in the paper, I do have some diagrams of the basic setups of both the MDTF and the MLR. So there's 5 MDTFs planned or actually established now. The first MDTF, the Multi-Domain Task Force of the U.S. Army, is located at Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington, state of Washington. Second MDTF is located in Wiesbaden, Germany, and Fort Drum, New York. Its area of operation. Okay, I'm sorry. The first MDTF in Fort Lewis McChord, Washington, is oriented towards the Pacific. The second MDTF, located in Wiesbaden, Germany, and Fort Drum, New York, is oriented towards Europe and Africa. The third MDTF is headquartered in Hawaii and has units located in both Hawaii and Joint Base Lewis McChord. The fourth MDTF will be located at Fort Carson, Colorado, with a focus on the Indo-Pacific. The fifth MDTF will be located at Fort Liberty, formerly Fort Bragg, in North Carolina, and has no designated support region yet. The first MDTF and the second MDTF are generally fully established. The third is in the process of forming. When we talk about the Typhoon missile system that is currently in the Philippines, that is part of the first MDTF. So already you're starting to see an exercise of the MDTF and how they plan on deploying. So as you can see from this, is that there's 5 MDTFs and 3 are going to be dedicated to the Pacific. There are 3 MLRs that are formed or are in the process of forming, all oriented toward the Pacific. This is part of a structure to contain China, to deter China from taking any actions in Taiwan. And as I stated above, a lot of China's ambitions militarily are based on having to get into the first island chain. That means Taiwan has to be neutralized at some point. It is basically the military problem that if China wants to be as aggressive and claim the expansions and the expansive claims in the South China Sea and be able to back them up, they have to get into the first island chain. And the best, most obvious way for them to do it, they politically stated it, is through the taking in Taiwan. So that is general, whatever it is, that the U.S. Army and U.S. Marine Corps will take a typical role for themselves, but are both forming organizations to be able to fill that role. Now, the MLR, you can see that it's probably not going to be effective outside of the Pacific. The MDTF will allow more flexibility outside the Pacific, though obviously that's just like when you talk about a command structure, like one of the joint command structures like CENTCOM, is they have orientations to a certain way. That's where their organizational structure goes towards, and that's where the expertise is. You'll probably run into the same thing with the first, like for example, the third MTTF located in Hawaii. It will be very much focused on Korea and operating in the Pacific. If something happened where it had to deploy to Afghanistan, okay, it could do it, but it would be out of its expertise zone, and so it would take some reorientation of maybe changing personnel somewhat. The MLRs are running into the same issue, is that they are pretty much a specialized group to operate inside the Pacific. Yeah, maybe eventually they could operate on some remote island in the Indian Ocean. But that's also, even though they have a small footprint, that small footprint is supported because the fact that the MLR would have the advantage of U.S. bases that could provide some level of support to MLRs from either coming from Japan, the Philippines, Guam, or from seaborne resupply. Much harder if they try to operate in some of these other areas of the country. So MLR is definitely a much more specialized type unit than the MDTF, but the MLR is also much more nimble to operate inside the expected zones that it will operate on in the Pacific facing towards Taiwan. All right, so I went through here with just not too much coughing. I want to thank you for all the supporters. I am getting close to 300 followers, or I'm sorry, 300 subscribers. So thank you very much for all my existing subscribers that have been with me and have joined along the way, and new subscribers, welcome. I did cross over 800 followers. I know that followers and subscribers can interlap. You can be both, so it's not like I have 1,000. It's still sitting at again, I think it was 297 today when I'm recording this on Saturday. So again, thank you very much for everybody. If you again, I appreciate all your support. I'm starting to review some other videos on both Rumble and YouTube, and locals are not doing. Rumble's doing okay, and monetization is not going well. So I might start reconsidering some of the issues, like I have cut back significantly on the amount of emails I send out. Basically, I've cut my emails in half. My views have dropped not quite in half because of that, but that's kind of be expected. But what I'm seeing, that the fact that I'm sending fewer emails out is prior to, I was sending out so many emails because I would do things to try to provide video services to YouTube and Rumble and locals. But now I'm starting to kind of pull back on those because especially YouTube, and YouTube had the short. So I just send out the samples as on notes, and so I don't send anything out on those. Well, what I've noticed is by the fact that I'm sending out fewer messages is I have fewer subscribers dropping out. So for example, it used to be I was getting when I got over 200 subscribers, what I was finding is for every 5 subscribers I would get, I would have 2 drop out. But there's one subscriber or Substacker, and she was very generous to give me some advice on things, and so she did. So I did a hybrid approach to what her advice was, and it did work. And so right now what I'm running into is I am getting about 4 subscribers for every 1 that drops out. So it's by sending fewer emails, I do get fewer views, but it also looks like I'm having fewer subscribers drop out because I'm not bombarding them with emails. So trade-off. I'm also looking at a possibility where they, talking to other subscribers, they said, if I write less often, like only post once a week or once every other week or once a month, your writing is much more impactful. And so you'll get more views, you'll get more followers, you'll get more subscribers, you get more paid subscribers if you do that. And a couple things I've also learned is shorter papers do better than longer papers, but not by much. And when I say longer, a long paper to me is about 1,800, so about 15 to 800. A mid-length is 1,000 to 1,200 words. So long for me, except for my first one, and I can write some long papers. I just don't do it on Substack. And like, for example, I had to doing some research for a subscriber, and it's a lot. It's a lot bigger than anything I write for on Substack. So long for me is 15 to 800, 1,800. Medium is call it 1,000 to 1,500, and then short is below 1,000 and typically sitting in that 500 to 800 words. The 500 to 800 words for they do slightly better than the longer papers. The longer my paper is, the less views and engagement I get from it. So if I went to only posting once a month, knowing that let's say if I go to, posting one paper every other week, would I have the impact? And let's say, so I post a 3,000 word paper every other week. It'll be, so it kind of is my same subject matter, but much more detailed, or add certain more levels of detail added to it. would it be as impactful as writing a shorter paper that tends to get more views than a medium paper? And so I'm really kind of struggling with that, as if that makes any sense to do. The other factor is that and I've even got comments on this, I'm not tooting my own horn, is I'm providing a geopolitical response to a current event, along with giving a multi-causal reason to view it, in something that is relevant within the news cycle. Put in the language of X. It's trending at the time I write about it. So I would be leaving that part out, where I no longer write about trending topics and just deal with maybe longer topics that are not relevant. Because just imagine when the MDTF, okay, that has been in the process for, you talk about that development, the thinking and the development towards the Pacific reaction to Taiwan. Again, you're going back to the second Bush administration. So obviously not a issue of staying up with current events. But a lot of what I write about, like the assassination threats against President Marcos, that is current event. So I write about the current event. So I'd be giving up in that area. And so I'm trying to really think about this. Is that something I want to do? Besides just being an opinion writer on current events, or do I want to go into more in-depth stuff? I like both. But knowing that shorter does better than longer, if I write a 3,000, 5,000 word writing, is that really even going to be read? Is it going to have any impact on way people view problems? And I don't know. I just kind of struggle with that. Oh, and one other thing, this was happened after I wrote this thing. Russia had threatened Japan that if they allowed the Marines to deploy missiles to Japan, they would react, and actually did a nuclear threat against them. So that came out after I wrote it. Is Nansei Island in Okinawa. They didn't say the MLR specifically, but the MLRs, I think it would be the. Let me see here if I have them. I think it's the. I don't know. Remember the MLR regiment? I think it's the. I don't remember. If I say something, I could be. It'd be just as likely wrong as I am right, so I'm not going to say it. But basically, the MLR that's operating out of Okinawa now is looking at deploying missiles, or at least one of the flexibilities with these MLRs, they may not have the missiles in place right at that time. They might train with some missiles, but they don't necessarily keep them in those environments for long periods of time. They move around. The MDTF is the same way. They're talking about storing missiles, but the Russians said told Japan that if they allow the U.S. to store or even deploy missiles in Japan, that there would be a response from Russia that could include up to a nuclear response. So that was kind of one of those quick events, the current events things. I did write about that in a response to my Substack original articles. But yeah, so that's one of my thoughts is that where I'm going to go with the writing here. Continue on as I go. I will probably become less video oriented. I'm thinking though the videos have been actually doing a little bit better on Substack as well. Not better than the writing. The articles always do better than the videos, but it seems to be picking up some where it's not picking up at all on YouTube. In fact, I'm getting ready to stop posting on YouTube. I might just post once a week just to keep my channel there and keep it active, but not actually post that often anymore. Because I think the last 10 videos I have 3 views. So it's ridiculous. All right, so I hope all of you have a great rest of your weekend, and please keep your comments coming. I very much enjoy those, especially on Substack. All of you have a good weekend. Thank you for your support. If you know anybody who's interested, please send them my work their way and see if they become a follower or subscriber. Any help is greatly appreciated. I hope all of you have a great rest of your weekend, and we will talk to you later. Bye.